Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the IDF Forum, How to Thrive and Survive in an Emergency. This is session 3 out of 3 programs. I'm Kathy Antela, Vice President of Education, and I will be your MC tonight. So very, very happy to see everybody here. And again, a huge welcome to you. And whether, I always say this, whether it's your first time or your 100th time, we are so glad you've joined us. Now, before we begin, of course, as always, a disclaimer. And even though tonight we are not going to be sharing medical advice or discussing medical advice or answering medical questions, just please remember that anytime you have a medical concern, to please contact a healthcare provider in order to get your questions answered concerning a medical condition. The mission of IDF is to improve the diagnosis, treatment, and quality of life of people affected by primary immunodeficiency through fostering a community empowered by advocacy, education, and research. It's by offering these tools and resources that IDF can fulfill its mission of seeking to ensure that everyone in the U.S. affected by PI has a fully informed understanding of the PI diagnosis that affects them, all available treatment options, the expected standard of care, and all of their opportunities for connection and support within the PI community. And a huge, as always, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to CSL Behring, Grifols, Takeda, Horizon, Octapharma, Accredo, ADMA Biologics, BPL, Farming, X4 Pharmaceuticals, Kedrion Biopharma, and Celio Health. These companies make these forums and other programs at IDF possible. So a huge, huge thank you to them. Now, at this time, on with the show. I would like to introduce tonight's presenter, who we have come to know pretty well and has shared some wonderful, wonderful information with us during the last 2 sessions about being safe, thriving, and surviving during an emergency. I have learned so much. So now, the introduction. Heidi Rosofsky is our presenter and has been involved in building community resilience in the face of emergencies for more than 40 years. In the early 1980s, after receiving a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, Heidi turned her focus to planning for community members who may need assistance, preparing for, acting upon emergency instructions, and dealing with the aftermath of disasters. She officially joined the zebra herd in 2013 when she learned she had CVID. Ms. Rosofsky is the senior emergency management emergency management consultant for inclusive planning at Global Visions Consortium, a member of the County Disabilities Access and Functional Needs Work Group, and the Operational Area Exercise Design Committee. And she is the national coordinator for the Abilities Expo Emergency Preparedness Initiative, and a member of Earthquake County Alliance, Great Shakeout Accessibility Committee, and a co-chairperson of the ECA in Southern California, where she is joining us from tonight. So with this, Heidi, welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So today is the third and final part of How to Survive and Thrive in an Emergency. And we'll be building on some of the things that we spoke about in the last 2. The agenda for tonight includes reconnecting with resources such as home healthcare providers and any other resources you may connect with on a regular basis outside, without a disaster happening. what to expect from local emergency management, and the importance of personal and community advocacy. One of the things that one of our sponsors talked about was having a care partner, and we actually also suggest what we call a personal support team, which are at least 3 people who can get to you via walking, who don't have to drive or anything else to get to you, who understand your care and can help you with anything that you may need, either during the evacuation period or after the disaster. So we're going to be talking a bit about what to expect from emergency management, where your personal and community advocacy can come in, and the things that you can do to make sure that you can survive and thrive after an emergency. So emergency management has 4 phases, and mitigation and preparedness are the 2 that occur before a disaster. It's really somewhat of a circle. So it's mitigation and preparedness. Then you have the disaster. It goes into response and then recovery. And as the community recovers, you go back to mitigating the any problems that you may have learned from the disaster, and that cycle continues. In the mitigation and preparedness phases is really where you need to start preparing your own family disaster plan, and also where you can, as a community advocate, get involved with understanding what the plans are within your local community and whether or not they're missing anything in terms of needing to know things about being able to meet your needs or others in your community who may have similar needs. In many jurisdictions, they now have what they call access and functional needs working groups, and these are working groups who work on concerns that could happen in a disaster and how to meet those needs. And just as we heard someone say about the group that they're involved with, they have it's that it's everything about us with us, or as they say in the disability community, nothing about us without us. So it's a situation that if we want our needs met, we have to help emergency management and first responders understand what those needs are and what kinds of resources we need so they can be included in the planning, and our needs can be met with realistically, they can be met with dignity, and that the disaster itself doesn't have to be a personal catastrophe for our health. So in the mitigation phase, actions are taken to prevent or reduce the cause or the impact or the consequences of the disaster. Things like flood control channels are an example of that. Maybe you've seen some areas where they put up retaining walls and so forth. Those are all mitigation types of things. This is emergency management community and the first responder, the government aspects of it, looking to reduce losses from a hazard, whether they are physical or whether it's through some form of regulatory actions to influence how land and buildings are built, where they're built, and how they're built. We've seen a lot of changes. I live out in Southern California. This is earthquake country. There have been a number of changes in the laws that have affected how buildings are built or how they are retrofitted in order to be safer in an earthquake. Those kinds of things are occurring for all kinds of disasters all over the world. Another example of some kind of a mitigation would be if you live in an urban brush fire interface area, the weed abatement or the cutting down and cutting away of weeds that are on government property, or in a lot of jurisdictions, you may get even a notice from the local government to do weed abatement in your area, and if you don't do it, they come out and do it, and they send you a bill for that. Part of that is to cut down on the possibilities of a fast-moving brush fire or a brush fire being able to burn down the house or create a safe space where it's defensible space from the part of the fire department. Constructing levees and permanent barriers to control flooding. We saw after Hurricane Katrina, where there was a lot done to rebuild the levees and to build them to withstand a hurricane better than it had prior to Katrina. Personal mitigation. This is something that was within you and your family's capabilities. If you live in earthquake country or even some of the areas that have high winds and tornadoes, there are programs and there are ways to, to brace and bolt structures so that they're more securely tied to the ground. We see this a lot out here in earthquake country, where homes that were built that weren't attached to the foundations in a way. So that is something that making sure your home can withstand an earthquake would be a mitigation effort if you were to have the your home braced or bolted to the slab. Reinforcing fencing so that your animals don't get out if they're in the backyard. So that maybe is something like if you have a wood fence, maybe putting up something that doesn't get blown down as frequently is if you're in a high wind area. We did that in our home. In fact, after about the third time winds had blown down our wood fence, we actually went ahead and put up a sturdier, block wall fencing that can withstand that much better. Creating defensible space, and this was what we were talking about, the weed abatement. So on your property, if you're in an area that is prone to wildland fires or something like that, creating defensible space means clearing out the weeds and planting fire-resistant vegetation like ice plants and things like that. One of the reasons why this is important is not only could it save your home, but when the fire department is looking to see what homes they can save and what they can't, they will look to see if they can find someone who has created that defensible space, and they will put their resources there because the others there may not be able to save irrespective of what they do. But those that have done the weed abatement in defensible space, they have a greater chance of being able to save that home. Even buying insurance to cover whatever the area hazards are in your area would be considered personal mitigation. If you live in a flood zone, a federally declared flood zone, the flood insurance is bought through the government. In California, we have the California earthquake insurance that is also supported by the government. There's a lot of areas where hazard specific types of policies are available when your regular policies won't cover it because of the high risk. I would say check into it, and if you can afford it, definitely consider doing it. Because unfortunately, all of the government programs and so forth are not going to make you whole. You have a better chance of rebuilding and recovering faster if you do have access to resources like that. One of the things that that is a part of the preparedness section of that circle we have, the emergency management preparedness area. This is the process of identifying the people, training them, the kinds of equipment that would be needed for a wide range of hazards. So identifying hazards, what hazards hit your, are likely to occur in your area. The development of a jurisdiction-specific emergency operation plan, which is usually at your city and or county level. The state will have one too, but the buck stops with the local government in terms of the responsibilities for caring for their citizens and making sure their operation plans account for disasters within their area. Identify emergency resources such as where are we going to locate shelters? Can we pre-identify them? In hurricane country, a lot of the shelters are pre-identified and pre-assigned, so people know which shelter they're supposed to evacuate to if they live in a given area. But you won't find that in disasters that have little or no warning, such as tornadoes or earthquakes. Sometimes in flooding with slow rising floods, you may see something assigned as well. recruiting and training emergency management personnel and response personnel. And this includes training the emergency responder and the emergency management community on what kinds of needs that are out there in the community. So what do we need what resources do we as primary immune deficiency, people with primary immune deficiency diseases, what kinds of things do we need to meet our needs? Has the city or county accounted for that? What can be done to ensure that they've looked at it and have a realistic plan in order to meet those needs? And they must meet them by law. Conduct drills, tabletop exercises, or full-scale exercises. You see this, like Red Cross will do drills, the government will do drills. In earthquake country, we have the Great California Shakeout, which is once a year, where everyone does what's called a drop, cover, and hold on drill. It's actually gone international now, but those are things that the emergency management community needs to be accountable for. From a personal preparedness standpoint, identify the hazards that are going to impact you and your family. Is your house located in a flood zone? Is your house located in an area where there's a historic landslide? Are you really close to the beach and have a tsunami hazard, or potentially a hurricane problem because you're within the storm surge areas? You need to contact your local emergency management, that would be city or county government. And even if they don't have the office specifically listed, someone within that government has a responsibility for emergency management. In smaller communities, it might even be the assistant city manager or the city manager, but you want to ask who has the responsibilities for emergency response plans. And that'll get you to the right people in terms of what information they have to help you with your personal preparedness, because that's another thing that the government's responsible for, is helping to educate the community about preparing for disasters. So, and then again, discussions of what your needs are and how will the emergency management community meet those needs should something arise where you are going to need assistance. So identifying the hazards that impact you and your family, develop and exercise family disaster plans. So create them and drill them. In my family, twice a year, we do an earthquake drill, and we go through and replace our food and medicals and medication supplies and so forth, and review our emergency plans. That's something that can be part of your personal preparedness as well. That plan needs to account for what are you going to do if you have to evacuate or shelter at home. Where do you go if you do need to evacuate? Who and how can you contact for help? So who can help you if you need assistance? The personal support team is what I said, and a lot of discussion about the personal support teams is in both section 1 and 2 of this series, in terms of what the personal support team is and who are good. The good candidates are essentially your neighbors, as your first responders are going to be your neighbors. If you all even think about what happened in Kentucky, most of the resources went to the Amazon factory, which wasn't in Kentucky, and the Candle Works factory. The resources were not yet available to go into neighborhoods and start to help get people out from areas that they were trapped in. That was done by the people within their community. So your first responder is often going to be your neighbor in a catastrophic disaster. And that's where your personal support team comes in. These are people with whom you've spoken about what your needs are, shown them where your supplies are, discussed with them how best to help you, and have really become a part of your team. And you too can be helping them with providing them with the preparedness information and sharing that information as you find it as well. putting together your disaster supply kits, and one of the, there are several handouts that were attached to part 2, including a great handout called 21 Weeks to Prepare. And that really is a calendar that sets out things you can buy for your disaster kit and action items that you can take to create your disaster plan so that it doesn't become overwhelming, either financially or emotionally, to try to get the things done that need to be done in order to have an effective, workable plan for you and your family. You also need to contact any regularly used resources to ascertain what their plans are. And by resources, I mean if you are receiving like your IG therapy via a home health agency that's coming out and accessing a port perhaps, or starting an IV, you want to know what that home health agency's disaster plan is. And I can tell you from my own frustration that oftentimes the answer is, oh, we got a plan, don't worry about it, you know, you'll be taken care of. Push beyond that and get details. Try to understand how it needs to fit into your disaster plan. If you go to an infusion center, you need to ask things like, okay, if this infusion center is within the disaster zone and isn't available, where do I go? How is that going to be facilitated? So really detailed questions so that you have a full understanding of how you can access the resources that you need. You also want to find out from your school, your kid's school, what plans that they have. If you have a child with a primary immunodeficiency condition, what happens if the children are evacuated from the school and are taken to another school? If they have any medications that need to go with them, how are they making sure that that's being transferred? How do you arrange to retrieve your child? Those are things that you need to also talk about. Maybe you have a specialty pharmacy that's providing your medication. Again, find out what you need to know in terms of accessing that medication. All that stuff is going to be tied to your pre-disaster address. But if you're going to be in a temporary housing situation, or even like a shelter or whatever for any length of time, you really need to find out how you can get they can get those medications to you if it's unable to be delivered to your home, and that you cannot stay in your home, or your home has unfortunately been destroyed. When the disaster occurs, the next phase is the response phase. This is where everything kicks into high gear, and the focus is on short-term life-saving needs immediately before, during, and in the short-term range after the incident. We've seen in some of the hurricanes what they call the Cajun Navy, which has started in Katrina and has now become a full-fledged non-government organization, where they go into communities that have been flooded and help to get people out who either chose to ignore evacuation orders, or a situation occurred where they were not expected to be flooded and wound up being flooded. And we're seeing a lot more of that in terms of areas that were not traditionally considered within a floodplain, are now seeing rivers that rise higher and so forth, and are being expanded into flood zones. So you need to find out. So that's the response phase. From emergency management, they are really focused on the greater good and the greater number. They are not going to be available. The first responders that you are used to picking up the phone and calling 911 for will not be readily available. In a smaller scale disaster that may impact just your city or your community, they will get mutual aid resources pretty rapidly, and they'll be able to start handling the individual problems that come up. But initially, they're going to be looking at the broader, wider picture, and they can drive right by your situation because they have a bigger target that they have to deal with. And it's not something we're used to seeing, and it's not something the first responders like anyway to do either, because they want to help, but they know that they have larger priorities that they have to deal with. In this phase, they're providing instructions to the public, whether it's to evacuate, the route you need to take to evacuate, whether you need to take your disaster supplies with you, whether you need to what they call shelter at home, which is basically not going out of your house, staying in your house until the immediate disaster has passed or the recovery efforts have started. So they are focused on conducting search and rescue, running mass care and feeding operations, that's sheltering. The feeding operations may be at the shelter themselves, or sometimes it'll be out in the community. Red Cross, for instance, has a mobile feeding program when it's safe to do that, when people are trying to recover and stuff, or they will send trucks in with coffee, sandwiches, that kind of thing. So this is the area and the level that emergency management is focused on. And they're focused on understanding the level of damage, because the level of damage and what's been damaged, how it's been damaged, and so forth, really plays a big role in determining what resources will be available for recovery from the federal government and on down to local and non-governmental agencies. From a personal response, from a personal side of response, this is where you need to take appropriate protective actions. In earthquake country, it's drop, cover, and hold on. You get under a desk or table, you cover your head and neck as best you can, and one hand holds on to your dance partner, because the motion of the earth is going to walk your dance partner away from you if you don't keep a hold on it. There are different responses based on the type of disaster. What you do for a tornado is not necessarily what you do for a hurricane. What you do for a flood is not necessarily what you do for storm surge. Contact your local Red Cross and your local emergency management and find out what are the disasters that are in your area and what the appropriate protective actions are that you need to take. And then you're going to be implementing your family disaster plan. All right, can we stay here? Do we need to go? Where are we going? How are we getting there? Those are all the things that you're going to want to implement. And you don't want to be trying to make up the answers as you go along. In that mitigation and preparedness time frame, that's the time to think this through, write it down, make your plans on how you are going to be able to get yourself and your family out if needed, or stay at home and sheltering with appropriate resources, whether the power is out. How are you going to manage with the conditions of the disaster? You want to follow official emergency instructions. That may include what they have as mandatory or voluntary evacuations. If you have a big family, or if you have a family where someone has a medical condition where there's a lot of equipment involved, if there's anything that's going to take more time, basically, to get you and your family ready to leave, you should be considering evacuating during that voluntary evacuation period. You can get to the shelters at a point where there will be more people and resources to help you in that area and that time frame. And then when the mandatory evacuation is called, if it's called, it'll be a situation where the roads will be added with more people, and there'll be more strain on the resources and more difficult for anyone who has additional needs that they have to consider to be able to get those needs met. So consider using that voluntary evacuation time as a time to really pull yourself together and start heading out. The recovery phase basically starts the minute it is safe. So when the earthquake shaking stops, when the hurricane has passed by, when the tornado has come through, where the flood waters are not, running through the streets to the point that they can wash you away, when it is safe to be able to move around and conduct like those search and rescue operations and so forth. So this is a time frame when the emergency management community will be focused on strategies to assist the community to rebuild and return to the affected area to normalcy as soon as possible. And this is where you start hearing about the resources of the federal government from FEMA, which has, when there's a presidential declaration like there has been in Kentucky, it opens up a lot of resources, both for the governmental side of the community and the individual side of the community. This is where some of the grants and loans come from to recover from a disaster. They don't necessarily make you whole, but they do put you in a situation where you can at least, be in a housing that's more traditional for you. You're not in a mass care shelter situation, so you're more like in an apartment, or maybe they've been able to fix something, you can go back home. This is where you need to be listening for information on those programs and being able to start the application parts for those programs and so forth. And which programs come into an area will depend on the amount of damage, how many people have been affected, and things like that. And personal recovery, this is where you start to implement the recovery strategies that you put together as a part of your family disaster plan back in the mitigation and preparedness phase. So what you need to do is contact your usual resources to restart whatever assistance that you normally have through them, whether it's Medicaid, Medi-Cal for health insurance, whether it's a home health care agency, or who knows, whatever kinds of assistance that you are receiving on a regular basis, you need to start reaching out to them and let them know what your needs are. You need to gather your information documents, and also in sections 1 and 2, we talked about some of the documents that you may need, and some of the information that is in the handouts that you can get from IDF also outlines the kinds of things that you need to put together. These are things like copies of birth certificates, any insurance that you may have for the property that's been damaged, things like a rental agreement or trustee property tax bill, something that shows, yes, you do indeed own the property that's there. These are the kinds of things that the information that's going to be needed in order to get the federal and state assistance flowing. And the more you have this organized, the less frustrating it will be. And it is frustrating no matter what, but the less frustrating it'll be, and the more rapidly you will be able to get your documentation in order to start receiving the funds that are necessary. Things like temporary housing, which can pay for a rental for up to a year, or there's a lot of things under that program where you have something that you are in until your house is either rebuilt, or either insurance or whatever whatever funds you're going to be getting from the disaster recovery funds is in place for you to decide whether you're going to rebuild or whether you're going to move someplace else. So go ahead and please, get the information from that in terms of the types of things that you need to keep together in that information kit. You can keep copies of the documents in your disaster supply kit. I recommend putting it on a disk drive. I recommend getting copies and putting it up in like a cloud-based server where you can access it through a computer, because at some point those types of computers, to be able to access that information, will be made available if you don't have access to it at the time, for people to be able to to pull down their recovery information and things like that. You need to put in the applications for the appropriate resources, and the local governments will be telling you what resources are in and available, where you can go to apply for them if it's a physical location. These days, a lot more of it is done either online or over the phone for the initial case registration to get things started. We're seeing that more and more often. Sometimes you'll see when infrastructure has been so damaged that you don't have access to the internet or things like that, you may see them opening what's called a one-stop center, which is where all the different recovery organizations that are going to be active in the recovery of that particular disaster will be housed essentially in one big room, and you go from table to table in terms of putting your applications in and getting the information that you need. You also want to make sure that you have either taken via your phone, do a video, or take pictures and again put it up on a cloud-based server, or put it on a disk or something of whatever your contents are of your house, because how much you're going to get for that, whether it's through insurance or whether it's coming from a government funded program, you know, if you didn't lose it, they're not going to replace it. So if it's something that that you need to prove that you had, and that particularly comes into like when things have been bought that are more recently bought, and perhaps the amount the insurance adjuster wants to give you is a lot lower than it should be because it is so new. So you need the kind of thing where you can show that if you have the receipt for it, again, take a photo, put it on the disk, anything that can help you to ensure you can get the most financial assistance from either the insurance or the federal governments that can compensate you for what has been destroyed by the disaster. Let's see. The other thing that's really, really important is to keep a log of all contacts you have with your regular resources and also the recovery resources. You want who you spoke to, when you called them, if you have a phone number or you get an email address or something, you want to keep a log of that because they have lots and lots of people that they're dealing with. You only have one family. So in order to make sure that you track of who you spoke to, what they told you, when the phone call occurred, it's a lot easier than having them try to plow through and find what the information is. And believe me, I've seen it more than once where the information wasn't entered correctly or isn't available. But if you have that log, you can go directly back to who it was you spoke to, what it was about, and that gives them a chance of finding whatever the information is. The other important thing that is in not just a part of emergency management or disaster preparedness is the idea of self-advocacy. And it's never more important than in a disaster situation where there are a lot of people clamoring for the same resources. You really need to be the squeaky wheel, polite squeaky wheel that stands up and makes sure that your needs are not plowed under by, you know, the sheer scope of the disaster, so that your needs can be addressed and met appropriately. Whether it's a situation where you are talking about a disaster or whether it's a personal disaster, just being the frustration of getting approvals for medication, or you have to see another doctor and getting the information that they need. The more you can self-advocate and put yourself on the team that's going to be assisting you, whether it be for disaster or medical or anything else, to be a full-fledged member of that team is part of self-advocacy. I will not work with a doctor who does not see me as being a part of the decision-making team. My body, my life. But there have been more than one time that I have had to nudgingly remind someone that, hey, I hear what you want to do, but this doesn't necessarily work for me, or I've tried that and it doesn't work for me. We need to go another route. And if I get patted on the head and someone looks at you like, where'd you get your medical degree? That's not the right doctor for me. So, and that's a part of my being able to advocate for myself. Self-advocacy, whether it's individual or whether it's advocating within your community, are the keys to resilience. And the more resilient you are, the more the faster and more completely you'll be able to recover from a disaster, physically, emotionally, financially. All of those come into play, and self-advocacy is the key to opening the locks that are blocking your ability to recover or get your needs met. You need to be able to effectively communicate, convey, negotiate, or assert your interests, desires, needs, and rights. So I had a situation where my insurance denied my IVIG for a while because they took my trough level and said, oh, you don't need IVIG. Look, your levels are fine. And they were not going to give it back to me until my levels got below, I think it was 200 or something like that. I had to go through multiple levels of appeals because a bunch of them were rubber stamped without ever getting my input until I got to an administrative justice. And I said to them, this is like telling a diabetic, you're fine with your sugar levels when you've had your insulin, but when you don't have your insulin, you're in trouble. And the administrative justice was not kind in what he had to say to the insurance company. And I got my approval, and I've never had a problem since. So being able to stand up for yourself, be sure you have your facts down, and being able to make sure your needs get met and that you don't get plowed underneath, whether it's a disaster or whether it's a personal emergency. You need to be sure that you can make your needs known and how they need to be met if you know. If you don't know, asking for that education so you understand that, so you can be a participant in your own care. It involves self-advocacy involves making informed decisions and taking responsibility for those decisions as well. If I have a choice between treatments and I choose one and it doesn't work out, it's like, okay, we tried that. Now let's try something else. You know, I'm taking responsibility for the fact that I was a part of that decision-making team and we tried it and it didn't work. Or it's the best thing that ever happened, and I'm so glad that I pushed for it. Whatever the situation is that it is, take responsibility on it and then take the next step depending on whatever you need. And the other side of that is holding the whoever needs to help you meet those needs accountable for the decisions as well. It's a critical life skill for something that is useful through your entire life. And I know from talking with Kathy and Colleen and so forth, this is a very commonly discussed situation, is the need for self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is often the key to your recovery. It's a part of your level of advanced preparedness, the ability to advocate for yourself and your family, discussing with your regular resources and not backing down if they give you an answer that doesn't meet what your needs. Discuss with your regular resources how they will meet your needs in times of disaster, and make sure that you get the answers that you need. You may trigger something where they have not done all the work that they think they have, and that they're in a situation where they have to go back and look at it and redo it. And if they do have to go back and look at their disaster plan and redo it, you know, that's a situation where now they're going to be more likely to be more realistic and actually have something that is not just in a binder up on a shelf, but something that is realistic and that will help their clients to be able to manage their care within a disaster setting. And asking specific questions such as, okay, how will I get my supplies and infusion if I'm in a shelter? What is the home health company's emergency plan? Who's going to come out? How do I get in touch with you? What do I need to do so that I can make sure that I don't miss my infusion beyond a point where it becomes threatening to my ability to be resilient and to be able to manage recovery in a disaster. One of the things about the recovery period of time and the response area immediately following disasters is that it can tax our immune systems. The water systems may have a lot of sewage or other chemicals or things in them that we're not used to being exposed to after disaster because of a lot of congregate care, things like shelters and so forth. A lot more colds and flus run through shelters. There's a lot more, there's much more stress on the individual, which, as we know, that tends to lower our ability to lower our immune system. Those are all things that are going to play in and be a part of this. So the last thing that you want is to not be able to ensure that your immune system is as good as it can be in that setting. So you certainly don't want to have something occur that you get sick from because of the disaster, when you can do as much as you possibly can to avoid that. Do you require power dependent equipment? I use IVIG. I have a powered pump. So if I don't have power in the house, how am I going to deal with that? Is there some way to run it off power? Is it going to be long enough to run off power on battery to finish my infusion? Or where do I have to go, or what am I going to do in order to be able to ensure that anything that I need that's powered is going to be able to, that power is going to be available. When a lot of power, like it's the situation in Kentucky and in the tornadoes we had, it's going to be a long time before power is back into the community. Even those parts of the community that weren't necessarily as damaged by the tornado, the infrastructure from the power and water and gas lines may have been impacted, and it may be a while before those are available to people whose homes are still intact. So there are things that you need to think about in terms of, if I'm going to be staying in my home and I don't have the usual utilities available, how am I going to manage that? How is that going to impact what I need in order to keep myself in the best shape possible to be through the recovery and to be resilient? What other kinds of assistance do you and your family need regularly, and how are you going to be sure that you have access to that information, resources, whatever it is? So you need to think about this wherever you have something that you use on a regular basis. That's like the finger in the dike. You need to make sure that you plug that hole and that you have a way of managing that so that you don't have just the whole thing collapsing, on top of you, so to speak. So what are you going to do? How are you going to manage it? And don't just stop at, okay, here's one way of doing it. Take a look. Having been in emergency management the length of time that I've been in, I have plan A, plan B, and I'm plan C, and I'm working on plan D. So, okay, if I'm going to try this route, I'm going to have a backup route to that in case route A of what I want to do isn't available. And do I need to do it route B? So for instance, if you normally infuse at home and you are unable to infuse at home for whatever reasons, where can you go in order to be able to get that infusion or the sub-Q treatment or however you're using it? And if the backup plan is a local infusion center that is connected to the home health agency, so then the question is, okay, well, what if that infusion center is impacted by the disaster? What's my next backup plan? So start kind of looking at the different scenarios and try to plan as deeply as you can. so that you have options. Because when you have options, you have more resilience. Panic occurs when people don't feel that they have any options to meet their needs. The more you plan, the more options you have, the better you are going to recover emotionally, physically, financially, and your children are going to take their cues from you. So if you are totally freaked out, your kids are going to be totally freaked out. And there are some studies that have really shown that children whose parents felt that they could that could be resilience, that they could recover, had less emotional problems recovering from the disaster than did children whose family, where their families felt like they were frustrated at their wits' end. They didn't know what they were going to do or how they were going to meet needs. Children are very sensitive to things like that. So the more planning you do, the more you help not only yourself, but your children and your other family members to be able to be resilient as well. And I said, like, what kinds of assistance you need and how do you receive this assistance and what are your backups for it? Those are the kinds of questions that you really want to ask and find the answers for. And the answers may lead to additional questions, and that's fine. That's just following the journey in order to put yourself in a position that you are the most resilient possible. One of the other things is that if anyone is on either disability or SSI or any means tested program, none of the federal disaster aid counts against you. So you will not be held, they will not stop your insurance, like if it's Medicare or not Medicare, if it's Medicaid or Medi-Cal, or if you're on some means tested program, they cannot stop or reduce your stipend or your insurance because of funds that you have received as a part of the federally declared disaster. Or even if it's not federally declared, if it's something more local and Red Cross is involved in handling it, any types of emergency disaster aid, whether it's for a single family fire or all the way up to a national disaster, that aid is not counted against you for any means tested any governmental means tested program. Another part of advocacy is community advocacy. And the more that you plan for yourself, the more resilient you become, the more you have an opportunity to share with friends and neighbors and your community to get involved in helping others to become as resilient as possible. So find other organizations and people with similar concerns. The bigger the group of people you can bring together to present to emergency management or your city or county, hey, we have these needs and we are concerned that they're not going to be met in a disaster. And what can we do to help you understand what we need and to make sure that whatever plans that you have made are really workable for meeting the needs. Those you'll see county and city working groups come together on accessibility, on health needs, medical needs, and it's not just people from the government circles. A lot of the requirements now coming down out of FEMA for planning and so forth require community stakeholder input. So the folks that are the ones that are the end users and have the needs are the ones that need to be consulted as a part of putting together a plan. And that's where there's an opportunity for you to learn more from others who are further along in the journey, or for you to help those who are just beginning the journey. And in general, to make your community more resilient and more ability to meet the needs of the whole community in a much more realistic and dignified manner. share. Another things you'll find in terms of community advocacy is you'll find that other areas are doing something that you may say, wow, that's a great idea. And that best practice might work here in my community. So the more hands that you connect with, the more organizations and people that you connect with and are able to share your story and able to share your concerns and needs, the more likely there will be redundancy in the ability to get your needs met. And don't be afraid if an organization or governmental agency really hasn't thought about what your needs are, you may be the first one who is bringing that type of need to them. And therefore, it allows them to have a learning curve to be able to meet those needs. And they'll find when one person brings it up that they will learn that there are a lot of others who have similar or the same needs that they need to plan for. So that's it for my presentation today. Stay zebra strong. And don't feel bad about taking those hind hoofs and giving a buck where you need to shake someone up and get them to understand what your needs are. And again, self and community advocacy are not just for disaster situations, they are for life skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Oh my goodness, we are going to be so prepared. Thank you for all that wonderful information. And at this time, I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Colleen Brock, Manager of Medical Programs at IDF. And she has a few questions for Heidi, our expert. So Heidi and Colleen, you just take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. We don't have a lot of questions. We had a comment in the box that says some electric companies will allow people who need power-based equipment to be the first on the list to get power back on. So I suggest that's something that you reach out to your electric company and see if they have that program, or if they know of what the resource would be, like Heidi said, for availability should you need to use that equipment in a place that does still have power.
Let me go first to the overall electrical issue, and then I'll discuss the some of the possibilities. The lists that electrical companies have for people who are on power dependent equipment is primarily used for notification of outages. They cannot guarantee that you'll be first in line to get your power on because the grid cannot be sourced to one house and not, the whole area. So that's in some ways somewhat of a misnomer. It's usually used, like I said, for notification of power outages, particularly planned power outages. And occasionally those that are unplanned, they will keep you updated on what's going on through either email or text or some communication forum. Now, what to do if you are in power dependent equipment? If you are, and that depends on the area you're in, the disaster that's involved. If you are in an area where you've been evacuated to a shelter, oftentimes the shelters will have generators that'll be powering them, or they'll have a reception and care center somewhere where it's powered, or they may even have an area where they say they're charging like batteries for different things. In Hurricane Sandy, there was a gentleman who had a powered wheelchair, and when he was up in an apartment on a high floor, and the problem was he couldn't recharge his wheelchair, and that also included speech equipment and some other things. So they actually wound up getting like a marine battery, a different type of battery to be able to, that people climbed up. I don't remember, it was something like the 15th floor or something even higher, where they were changing the batteries out, taking the batteries someplace and charge them, because he couldn't get down, and he couldn't get down in his chair because the elevators weren't working. It just didn't make sense to try to move him to a different shelter location. Instead, they were bringing batteries and rotating batteries and taking them and charging them to him. If you're in a brush fire, wildland, urban interface area, often, and this is particularly true in California, Colorado, some of the areas that have had these massive brush fires, often that are caused by, or in part caused by high winds. A lot of the winds have down power lines that have started some of these major wildfires. They are now taking protective action and shutting the grid down when certain types of wind conditions are likely, and they will send a notification. So it's up to you to think, to look at, is there someplace I can go for the few days that power may have been shut down preventatively? Or in Northern California, with Pacific Gas and Electric, they have a program where they are loaning like small generators and so forth to people who have power dependent equipment. And this is something that, again, is more usable in a home variety. It may not be usable in an apartment setting. So it really depends on what programs are available in your area, who's talking about it, who's working on it, and what are the resources that'll be made available to you. In general, figure on either charged batteries needing to come to you or having backup battery systems. If it's a cell phone, they've got a lot of things that can charge cell phones really fast, that can fit in your purse. But major power outages or power outages that cover a wide area, they're not going to prioritize your house first. They're just going to prioritize areas as they get them going. And areas like hospitals and so forth are first and foremost. You'll be much further down the line.
Thanks, Heidi. I'm going to mention, I liked how you said about putting your information, whether you have videotaped your house and belongings, or whether you've taken pictures, but storing them in the cloud. In looking at the devastation in the numerous places this week, there were multiple places. All that was left was a slab. Yep. So there's no going back to find any kind of paperwork. There's no going back to find the name of your insurance company or the receipt for something you bought. It's all gone. And so I like how you said about putting that material somewhere in the cloud where you can have access to it no matter where you are located. The other thing that I kind of want to bring up, as I said before, we've now been hit by a hurricane, tornado, and a flood. So I've learned a lot, although wish I had known what you've taught us. But the other thing that I would recommend is that both of you, all of you, the head of the household and somebody else in the household, maybe even older children, understand where things are that may be needed in a serious emergency. Case in point, our neighbors directly across the street from us were in their late 60s. His mother lived with them and she was in her 80s. And it was the time period. He took care of everything. He wrote the bills. He took care of her. And he died that night. And she was left absolutely bewildered. She had no idea where anything was. She had no idea how to do anything. She needed to find files. She needed to find paperwork. She needed to know things. I mean, God bless her. She didn't even know how to put film in a camera. Yeah, it was that long ago. But, just making sure that you're not depending on one person to help you in a case of emergency, that you know where those documents are, along with maybe your significant other, or even, God forbid, something happened to both of you, that a relative has access to those documents for your children's sake or an older child. And I think Heidi would agree with me that just having one person kind of being the go-to for everything is not always optimal.
No, it isn't. And the best, and even in a situation like if you have a disk that has all of this stuff in it that's in your disaster kit in your house, I would recommend that you send a couple to friends or family members that are unlikely to be impacted by the same disaster that you are. So it's someone who's 100 miles or more away who can hold on to that disk for you, and get it back to family members if needed for any of those situations. That's and like I said, having a backup in the cloud these days is also that other way to do it. It's a great way to do pictures too, either the disk or the clouds or a thumb drive or something where more than one person does have that and it's holding it for you. A lot of people say, well, I can put one in my safety deposit box, and that's providing that the bank hasn't, even though a lot of the structure of the bank may survive, it may be a while before employees to get there to be able to let people in to get to safety deposit boxes and so forth. So it's something that you really need to look at, that more than one person has it. There's more than one way to get it. And again, like Colleen said, it's not just for disasters, it can be for personal emergencies as well, where you need that kind of information.
And it's also making sure that not only do they have that information, if it's password protected, they have the passwords. So don't just, oh, it's in the cloud and you know the password and maybe somebody else in your family, but that's it. And the people who have those materials they can't get to them. We do have a question that came up. Speaking of elevators, do you have strategies for getting help more urgently with unworking elevators that disabled people are depending upon, either during an emergency or otherwise? Is there some regulation that can be cited to help expedite getting elevators fixed?
In a disaster, getting elevators fixed may not necessarily be seen as a high priority, but getting someone out of a building may be. Like I said, in a situation with Hurricane Sandy, it was decided that it was a better situation for them to stay at home, and they worked out a way to deal with getting the batteries and food supplies and everything up there. And there are devices out there called stair chairs. They are designed for someone who would not be able to walk down multiple flights of stairs. And it is a device. It is something that it may be something that for multi-story condos, a homeowners association might decide to purchase. Definitely a work environment. It's something that can be that the employer can provide. This would come under the Americans with Disabilities Act in terms of reasonable accommodation. Disasters and emergencies are covered under ADA, and especially when it comes to the planning and preparedness aspect of it. Larger companies are required to have disaster plans, and they also must be able to meet the needs of their employees, including those with disabilities. There are sometimes people with disabilities, particularly those with not readily noticeable disabilities, are uncomfortable letting their employer know, as they're afraid it'll impact their ability to get a promotion, or that they'll be viewed differently than they are. It's something that can be that can be a conversation with HR that doesn't get shared with supervisors or something unless there's a need. And that need must be strictly disaster or related or medical emergency related. So there are, and as far as there are some other ways of being able to get someone downstairs if you don't have the stair chair, that to be able to get someone down. It is something that you would want to do some research into some of those ways, and maybe even talk to your local fire department about what ways they, if you see several of them, what do they suggest? How do they suggest letting someone know that you can't come down the flights? Many years ago when I was in Hawaii on vacation, and we had a fire alarm come up, and the elevators all go to ground as soon as there's a fire alert. So I put myself into the corner, out of the way of the flow of people coming down the stairwell in a manual wheelchair. And every third or fourth person, I kept saying, tell the fire department they have a wheelchair on 6, the floor that I was on. Tell them that they have a wheelchair in the stairwell on 6. The stairwells are smoke and fire protected. So if there's fire, if you feel heat or you are getting smoke, that may be a place you can stay as long as you don't block the pathway. As if people feel that the pathway down is blocked, you'll wind up injuring yourself or someone else. So, and that's where the personal support team concept comes in too. If you're going to need assistance getting downstairs, multiple stairs, whether it's at work or at home or wherever you spend a lot of time, you need to have that conversation and to have a minimum of 3 people who have worked with you, trained with you, that you have actually drilled how you're going to get downstairs, and they've actually worked with you to do that, so that everybody knows how it's done, what needs to be done, and how best it's going to work for you. Another situation that occurred after an earthquake out here that affected a local hospital. A friend of mine who has her knees in a bent position, fused in a bent position, was in a wheelchair, and so many people tried to pick her up, put her on a gurney, and try to straighten out her legs that she finally told them, just tell the fire department I'm here, or tell it was the hospital administration I'm here, because people were not listening to what she needed. They could have injured her, and that people were not, she was there for a test, so it's not like she'd have a personal support team there, but they weren't listening either. So that's another key skill in a disaster, whether you're in your neighborhood and helping people in your neighborhood, try to find out if anyone has specific accessibility needs or anything, and work with them on how best to do that. And that personal support team, those people are going to need a way to get into your house. So they're going to have to, you're going to have to build trust with them, where they have access to a key to get in, or, to be able to make sure you're okay. Or the same thing if you're a personal support team member, if you're going to be going into someone's home to help them. This is a team event and team situation, and that trust has to be built, and that, and everyone has to really understand how best to assist, and how best and what needs to be done or not done to be able to ensure that everybody gets out safely.
And that's a very good point in somebody who has physical disabilities and harming them by trying to help them. I know my sister has cerebral palsy, and when she falls down, people rush to jerk her up, and she will yell at them, please don't help me, because she can actually torque her back by having you jerk her up, trying to help her, versus just letting her do it herself. So oftentimes it's better to say, how can I help you, than just assuming. So yeah, that's a very good point, Heidi.
That how best can I assist you is the first thing you should say to whomever is having an issue. If someone's fallen or whatever, whether it's a medical, physical emergency or whatever, before you move someone, how best can I assist you? There may be situations under which it's not a good idea to move them, and listen to what the response is. Individuals who live with disabilities know much more about the workarounds that work for them than people who don't, and don't make assumptions. So that needs to be a two-way communication skill.
Absolutely. One more question, and then I have a big announcement to make. There are a lot of people, just in general, with the PI community included, who want to help. you've been in these situations, what is the best way that people can help those who are going through such horrific disasters as happened this week?
So when you have a major disaster, this is something that happens all the time. People clean out their closets because they think if they send clothing, that'll help. It actually becomes more of a problem than it becomes a solution, because then there has to be someone who can inventory everything and see. People have to figure out, if it'll work for them or not. Frankly, financial donations to legitimate organizations that are active in disaster is the best way to help, because then resources can be applied appropriately. As an example, Red Cross has an emergency assistance program, and it's a grant situation where people can deal with how they want to meet their needs, the best way to meet their needs, given the resources that are there and available. I can't tell you, it was after a flood or something like that. I can't tell you how many pairs of high heels got sent after one of the hurricanes. And the last thing you need for mucking around in debris is high heels.
Yeah.
So it's real. That's why those organizations that do this on a regular basis, and there are a number of them. And if you Google organizations active in disaster, even in your own area, you'll find a lot of voluntary organizations active in disaster that you can make a donation to. That most, if not all of the money will go toward helping the people that are actually there to recover in the way that's best for them, because not everyone has the same needs either. So that's a much better way of doing it than trying to send things. Even at this point in time, any available space that is still up and standing is being used for mass feeding and mass sheltering. The last thing they need is to try to have to inventory a bunch of used clothes and see if any of them fit the people that are there. So it's a situation where you really have to think about how useful is this really going to be.
Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate it. And I thank you for all of the information that you've given us over these past 3 sessions. You have been very generous and kind with your input and thoughts and how we can all best prepare for any emergency. And as we are learning this week, and as we have said in the past 2 sessions, just because it hasn't happened before doesn't mean you don't need to be prepared, because things are changing and you could be facing something that has never hit where you live in the history of recordings. But I would like to make an announcement. IDF has been working behind the scenes with our Nurse Advisory Committee, and we have come up with a wallet-sized card that is going to be double-sided that somebody can take to the emergency room or an urgent care. So look for that at the beginning of January. I was honored to be part of the committee that worked on it, and we submitted it for final approval today. So it's going to go through the process of being approved, and it's going to have basics. So you have to remember that we had to be very broad in its scope, because everybody's journey is different in an emergency. But one of the things that it's going to say in big red letters is, I am immunocompromised. And if there's one thing that we can be thankful to COVID for, it is everybody knows what that word is now. So you don't have to explain what that is anymore. But I hope that it will be well received by the community, that it will be helpful, and stay tuned. It will be available on the website, and there will be notices going out about it, and it will be a resource available for everybody in the PI community. But again, Heidi, I thank you, and I am going to let Kathy take over from here.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Heidi. Great information. And we have a comment here from somebody who says, this program has been the best motivation to get organized, totally organized. Thank you. I can't agree more. At this time, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Heidi. Thank you to all of you for hanging in there with us, for submitting great questions and your support. Wishing you the most wonderful holiday season ever, and look forward to seeing you in 2022 on January 6th, when we have a forum about immune system basics and primary immunodeficiency. So good night, be healthy, and take care.